Close your eyes for a moment and picture the medieval world. The year may be 1200 or perhaps a little later, but the landscape remains timeless in its quietness. The sun slips behind low hills. A dusty path winds across fields of barley and wheat, a path worn down by countless footsteps, wooden cartwheels, and hooves. The air carries the smell of earth, smoke from a distant hearth, and the faint sound of church bells calling the faithful home. This was the world of travel in the Middle Ages, and it was not an easy world to move through. Roads were rarely paved, except in old Roman towns where fragments of stone still clung stubbornly to the earth. More often, a road was nothing more than a dirt track, muddy in rain, rutted in dry seasons, sometimes little better than a line of flattened grass. Bridges, where they existed, were made of wood and prone to rot. Rivers had to be forded, sometimes dangerously, and forests could stretch for miles without a landmark to guide a traveler. Travel in this era was slow. A horse could carry you further, but few could afford to ride one for daily life. For most, journeys were taken by foot, step after step, across fields, through valleys, and over uneven ground. The average person might not travel more than a few dozen miles from the place they were born. Life seemed small, contained within a ring of familiar villages and neighboring parishes. And yet, within this seemingly narrow circle, movement was constant. The idea that medieval people lived entirely still, confined to their cottages, is not quite true. People did move, often and with purpose. And among them, women's footsteps were perhaps more frequent than men's in many ways, though their journeys have been less celebrated in the records. Why was this so? To answer, we must first imagine the rhythms of daily life. A man might work the fields, tending crops that required long days close to home. His labor tied him to the soil. Planting, weeding, harvesting, and repairing tools. Fields anchored him. Women, on the other hand, carried out tasks that pushed them outward, fetching water from distant wells, collecting firewood from forests, walking to mills to grind grain, or leading children to markets in nearby towns. Every step of care, every errand for the household, stretched their map a little wider. Picture a woman balancing a clay jug on her hip, walking steadily down a lane bordered by hedges. Her bare feet know the path, for she takes it every day. The well lies a mile from her cottage, but she walks it without hesitation, greeting other women along the way, trading news as easily as they trade smiles. On another day, she walks even farther, to a neighboring village's market. There, she exchanges eggs for salt or wool for thread before beginning her return journey. These paths, repeated day after day, widened her world, a world traced by familiar footsteps. There were also the broader journeys, ones that lifted women beyond their village lives. When roads carried groups of pilgrims toward shrines and holy relics, women were often among them. When fairs drew sellers and buyers from distant regions, women came with baskets, goods, and children in tow. And when weddings, births, and funerals called, it was women who traveled in numbers, crossing boundaries of kinship and community. But before all of these stories, before pilgrimages, before markets, before the excitement of fairs, we must remember that travel itself was an act of courage. To leave home was to step into uncertainty. The road carried risks, sudden storms, wild animals, or the simple exhaustion of distance. Yet countless women accepted these challenges with quiet determination. They moved not to conquer, not to boast, but to carry life forward in small, enduring ways. Imagine the narrow tracks at dusk. The road is empty now, save for one traveler. She walks slowly, her shawl pulled around her shoulders, the faint weight of her day's gathering resting in a basket at her side. The world is hushed, fields silvered by moonlight, the sound of her footsteps soft against the earth. To an outside eye, her journey may seem small, a mere few miles between her village and the mill. But to her, it is part of a much greater pattern, one that connects her to the broader world of medieval life. And so, when we begin to ask why medieval women traveled more often than men, the answer is not in grand adventures or dramatic quests. It is in these modest, persistent journeys, roads less taken by knights and lords, but often taken by mothers, daughters, widows, and wives. The world of medieval travel was shaped not only by those who rode on horseback to war, but by women who walked steadily, quietly, and unrecorded along paths that kept life turning. This is where our story begins, on the roads less taken, where women's steps echoed softly through the centuries. When we think of travel in the Middle Ages, one of the most familiar images is the pilgrimage. It was not a holiday nor a casual trip. It was a journey of the soul, a movement of the heart as much as of the body. To step onto the pilgrimage road was to step into a tradition that stretched across kingdoms, carrying the faithful toward holy places believed to hold healing, forgiveness, and blessings. For women, pilgrimage was one of the most accepted and visible reasons to travel. In a world where social rules often kept them close to hearth and home, the call of a shrine offered a way to walk beyond those limits with respect and legitimacy. A woman could leave her village, sometimes even cross a sea, and still be considered dutiful, pious, and honorable. The act of walking itself became sanctified, the miles transformed into prayers. Picture the roads of England or France in the spring. The fields are greening, and groups of travelers gather on the roadside. They carry little, perhaps a staff, a pouch with bread and cheese, a wooden cross around the neck. In the crowd, you would notice women of all ages. Some are elderly, leaning on sticks, determined to reach a holy site before the end of their days. Others are young, walking with quiet excitement, perhaps hoping for a blessing that might help them marry, bear children, or find healing. Mothers carry children on their hips. Widows walk with their heads covered, whispering prayers. Every step has meaning. Destinations varied, but some became famous across Europe. The shrine of St. James at Compostela in Spain, the relics of St. Cuthbert in Durham, the tomb of Thomas Becket in Canterbury, holy wells in Ireland, springs said to cure sickness, chapels dedicated to the Virgin Mary. A woman who may have never traveled beyond her nearest market suddenly found herself walking across counties, sleeping beneath the open sky, joining her voice and song with strangers on the road. Pilgrimage was not always easy. Roads were rough, weather could be harsh, and nights were long and uncomfortable. Yet the sense of community softened the hardship. Women were rarely alone. They moved in groups, often alongside neighbors or family. The rhythm of footsteps, the murmur of prayers, the kindness of shared food all created a journey that was less about distance and more about belonging. There were also practical reasons. Pilgrimage allowed women to step into networks of hospitality. Inns, monasteries, and churches opened their doors to pilgrims, offering bread, broth, or a place to rest.
Symbols such as the scallop shell or a palm branch marked a traveler as a pilgrim, and with that mark came a measure of safety. Women traveling under this sign were seen as walking under God's protection, their movement respected in a way other forms of travel might not have been. Some women undertook short journeys, perhaps to a local shrine just a day or two away. Others crossed entire kingdoms. A noblewoman might travel to Rome or even Jerusalem, her pilgrimage lasting months or years. For poorer women, the distance was smaller, but the act was no less profound. To walk 10 miles in prayer was as significant in its way as sailing across the Mediterranean. Pilgrimage also gave women a voice in history that they might not otherwise have had. Chroniclers occasionally mention groups of female pilgrims, noting their devotion. Legends grew of women who walked extraordinary distances or who received visions along the way. Though most went unrecorded, their footsteps left invisible paths across Europe, weaving women's presence into the fabric of medieval mobility. Close your eyes again and imagine one such journey. The road winds uphill toward a small stone chapel said to house the relic of a saint's hand. The air is cool and damp. A woman walks steadily, her cloak gathered close. In her pouch, she carries a small candle which she intends to light at the shrine. Her prayer is simple, for her child to recover from illness. She does not know if it will be answered, but she knows the journey itself matters. Every step is a form of hope, a reminder that she is not powerless in a difficult world. Pilgrimage, then, was more than just travel. It was an expression of resilience. It allowed women to step beyond their everyday boundaries and join a greater story, one that connected villages, towns, and nations. And because it was accepted, even encouraged, it became one of the most common ways medieval women found themselves on the move. In the quiet of history, their journeys remain largely unseen. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the soft echo of their footsteps carrying prayers across the centuries. If the Pilgrim Road was a path of faith, then the road to the market was a path of necessity. Every village in the Middle Ages had its own rhythms of work and harvest, but the true heartbeat of medieval life could often be found at the marketplace. It was here, in the bustle of trade, laughter, bargaining, and exchange, that women found themselves traveling often, weaving journeys into the fabric of daily survival. Markets were more than places to buy and sell. They were the lifelines of entire communities, gathering points where food, goods, and stories flowed together. The weekly or seasonal market pulled people from miles around, drawing farmers, craftsmen, herders, and merchants into one vibrant space. And among the crowd, women were everywhere. Some came with baskets of eggs, butter or cheese. Others brought spun wool or woven cloth. Many arrived with children in tow, balancing the roles of mother and trader in one continuous motion. Imagine the sight. The open square of a market town on a bright morning. Wooden stalls are lined with cloth, their rough planks covered with sacks of grain, piles of onions, skeins of yarn. The air carries the scent of herbs, baked bread, and smoked fish. Chickens squawk in wicker cages. Bells from a church tower mark the hour, but no one slows. Bargaining fills the air, voices rising and falling in a music of commerce. And walking among it all, women travel from stall to stall, haggling, trading, greeting neighbors from distant hamlets. Some journeys were short, just a few miles from one village to the next. Others were much longer, for great fairs might be held only once or twice a year. These fairs, sometimes lasting days, could draw crowds from across entire regions. Cloth from Flanders, spices from the East, tools from German forges, all met the modest produce of local women who had walked for hours to sell butter or flax. For them, such fairs were more than an errand. They were an adventure. It is easy to forget how far a few simple errands could carry someone. To grind grain at a mill might mean a journey of several miles. To trade surplus eggs for salt, a woman might walk across fields, ford streams, or pass through forest. What seems like a small act to us today, a quick shopping trip, was in the Middle Ages a real journey. And women were the ones most often making those journeys, week after week, season after season. Markets also became social crossings. News traveled here faster than anywhere else. Women exchanged not just goods, but stories about weather, illness, marriages, births, and rumors of distant places. The marketplace became a kind of map, linking distant communities together through the footsteps of women who carried both produce and information back home. In noble households, the pattern was different, yet still present. Wealthy women might not walk to the market themselves, but they often managed the economic affairs of estates. When goods had to be sold or bought, when cloth was ordered or grain negotiated, it was often a lady of the house or her trusted servants who made arrangements. These tasks sometimes required travel to towns, monasteries, or fairs, placing noblewomen too into the network of medieval movement. For some women, markets even opened the door to larger business ventures. Records tell of widows who took up their late husband's trades, selling cloth, ale, or leather. Others became recognized traders in their own right, traveling between fairs to buy low and sell high. While men's journeys to battle or guild meetings may be the ones remembered in chronicles, women's journeys to stalls and fairs were the ones that kept households alive. Pause for a moment and imagine one of these women on the road. It is early morning, the sky pale with dawn. She carries a basket of cheese wrapped in cloth, balanced against her hip. Her youngest child walks beside her, tugging at her sleeve, while an older daughter follows with a jug of honey. Their village lies behind them, a small cluster of thatched roofs. Ahead, the road stretches toward the town where the market bell will ring by mid-morning. They walk quickly, but there is no rush. Their steps are steady, practiced, and sure. They have walked this path many times before. By evening, they will return home with salt, cloth, and perhaps a few coins. Their feet will be tired, but their household will be supplied. And the journey itself, though unremarkable in the eyes of history, has quietly stretched the boundaries of their world. When we think of markets and fairs in the Middle Ages, it is easy to picture the colorful stalls and exotic goods. But the deeper truth lies in the travelers who made them possible. Women walked to market not for leisure, but for survival. And in doing so, they became some of the most consistent travelers of their age. Their journeys remind us that history is not only made on battlefields or in royal courts. Sometimes it is made in the simple act of walking a dirt path to a crowded square, a basket on one's arm, carrying the life of a household with each step.
Marriage in the Middle Ages was not only a family affair, it was also a journey, sometimes a long one. For women especially, marriage meant leaving behind the familiar paths of childhood and stepping onto new roads that led them to other households, other villages, and sometimes even other regions or kingdoms. A wedding was more than a union of two people. It was a bridge between families, neighbors, or estates, and for that bridge to be crossed, the bride often had to move. Where she had lived since birth, where she had worked in fields or spun wool beside her mother, was not always where she would spend her married life. The custom of the time nearly always carried her away. Picture a small medieval village preparing for a wedding day. The church bell rings out, summoning neighbors and kin. Outside a cottage, a young bride is ready to depart. Her gown may not be rich, perhaps simple wool, dyed in plant colors, but it has been carefully washed and pressed. Around her waist, a belt tied with care. In her hair, a wreath of herbs or flowers. She steps forward, surrounded by family, as the procession begins. This procession itself was a journey. The bride walked, sometimes carried in a cart, from her home to the church and then on to her new husband's house. Along the way, the community joined in, singing, playing simple instruments, or carrying torches in the dusk. Neighbors lined the path, wishing her well. And though the distance might only be a few miles, the meaning was enormous. She was leaving one life behind and beginning another. For noble families, the journey could be much longer. Daughters of lords or kings often traveled across great distances to marry into alliances. A princess might leave one country for another, escorted by retinues, carrying dowries of gold, cloth, or even entire estates. These journeys could last weeks or months, moving through towns, castles, and rivers. Along the way, the sight of a noble bridal procession became a spectacle for those who watched it pass. Banners flying, carts laden with gifts, the bride herself the center of attention. But whether simple or grand, the essence was the same. Marriage carried women along the roads. It was not only the bride who traveled. Attendants, sisters, cousins, and neighbors often walked with her. In some places, traditions asked the bride's companions to guard her from mischievous pranks or to carry gifts to her new home. These groups of travelers gave marriage the air of a small migration, whole clusters of women moving together in celebration. We can also imagine the quieter side. A young woman, married into a distant village, saying farewell to the hills and streams of her childhood. Her heart heavy, yet hopeful. The path beneath her feet feels strange, for she knows she may never walk daily again in the lanes she once called her own. The weight of the journey is not only in distance, but in the shift of identity, from daughter to wife, from one household to another. Sometimes the journey stretched across cultures. In border regions, marriages linked different languages and traditions. A woman leaving her homeland for such a union had to learn new ways of speech, dress, and custom. Her travel was not only physical, but cultural, a step into a new world. In the eyes of history, These bridal journeys may seem small details, overshadowed by treaties and wars, yet they were central to medieval life. Each step a bride took carried with it the continuation of family lines, the weaving of social bonds, the survival of households. Imagine again the evening of a wedding day. The procession is ended at the new home. The bride steps through the threshold, her family's blessings still echoing in her ears. She sets down the small bundle she has brought with her, perhaps a chest of linens, a necklace, or just a comb passed down from her mother. Around her, a new family greets her. Outside, the torches dim. The path she has traveled lies behind her, but it will remain a part of her story forever. These bridal journeys may not look like travel in the adventurous sense. No maps, no faraway lands, no chronicles of exploration. But they remind us that medieval women were often in motion, carrying their lives from one place to another. Each wedding procession, each step to a new household was part of the hidden geography of the Middle Ages, roads traced by women, quietly, steadily, across the centuries. And so, when we think of why women traveled more often than men, marriage stands out as one of the most common reasons. For men, marriage rarely required leaving home. For women, it almost always did. In the hush of a medieval village night, when a mother felt the first pangs of labor, the sound that broke the stillness was not a call for a priest or a lord, but for a woman, the midwife. She would be summoned quickly, perhaps woken from her own bed, and without hesitation she would set off, carrying with her not only experience, but also comfort, calm, and knowledge passed down through generations. Midwives were among the most frequent travelers of their communities. Their work demanded movement, for childbirth did not keep to one house or one village. When a baby was ready to come into the world, the midwife went where she was needed, whether across the lane or across fields in the dark of winter. Picture a narrow dirt path lit only by a lantern. A woman walks steadily, her shawl drawn tight against the cold. In her satchel, she carries herbs, linen cloths, and perhaps a small wooden cross. She has walked this road many times before, called to homes in moments of urgency and hope. Each step is guided by duty, not choice. She is the quiet traveler of life's threshold. Beyond midwives, other women also moved constantly as healers and herbalists. In a world where formal medicine was scarce and doctors were few, women became the bearers of everyday cures. They gathered plants from forests and meadows, roots from riverbanks, flowers from hedges. These collections stretched their steps across landscapes. One day they might climb a hill in search of sage. Another day they might walk through damp meadows to gather valerian or comfrey. These collections were not idle wanderings. They were purposeful, careful, and deeply tied to survival. Women who knew the land could provide salves for wounds, teas for fevers, ointments for aching joints. Their feet pressed into paths that were invisible to others, secret tracks that led to the places where healing grew. And like the midwives, these healers often carried their skills beyond their own households. A neighbor would knock at their door asking for a remedy. A farmer might send word for help when his child was ill. And so the healer would travel, sometimes a short distance, sometimes farther, to bring her knowledge where it was needed. These journeys were quiet but constant. Unlike soldiers marching in ranks or merchants moving with carts, the midwives and healers traveled alone or in small company, unnoticed by chroniclers. Yet their role was vital. Without them, communities would have faced even greater hardship. Imagine again a scene. A woman sits by a riverbank, cutting mint leaves with a small knife, placing them carefully into a basket. The air is filled with the sound of water and birdsong. She knows which plants grow in shade, which bloom in sunlight, which roots to dig in autumn, which flowers to gather in spring. Her knowledge is a map, not of roads and towns, but of hedges, fields, and forests. And her travels, though small in distance, are vast in importance.
For noblewomen, too, healing could mean travel. Some managed household infirmaries where servants and tenants came for care. Others journeyed to monasteries to obtain herbs or relics believed to cure illness. A lady might travel miles to pray at a shrine, not only for her own health, but for the well-being of her children and household. The journeys of midwives and healers also carried a social dimension. Each visit, each path walked, strengthened bonds between women. Birth, illness, and recovery were times of gathering, times when women moved together. They supported one another, comforted one another, and in doing so, created a web of connection that stretched far beyond the walls of any single cottage. These travelers remind us that mobility is not always about distance or drama. Sometimes it is about constancy. The midwife who walked at night in the snow, the healer who gathered plants at dawn, the herbalist who crossed fields to tend a sick neighbor. Their travels may not appear in maps or chronicles, but they were journeys that shaped the very rhythm of life. When we speak of medieval travel, we often imagine caravans of merchants or knights on long campaigns. But the truth is that the most frequent travelers were sometimes the most overlooked. Women whose footsteps kept communities alive. Women who carried knowledge, comfort, and healing from door to door, mile by mile, year after year. Close your eyes for a moment and picture again that lantern in the dark, bobbing slowly as a midwife makes her way down a winding lane. Somewhere ahead, a mother waits. Somewhere behind, a community rests, trusting that when the call comes, she will walk the path again. In this way, midwives, healers, and herbalists were the steady travelers of the Middle Ages, walking not for wealth, not for adventure, but for life itself. When we picture noblewomen of the Middle Ages, it is easy to imagine them seated in grand halls, overseeing servants, or stitching in chambers lit by candlelight. But this picture, while true in part, is incomplete. Noblewomen were not always still. Their lives, tied to estates, marriages, and courts, often placed them on the road. They became travelers in ways both ceremonial and practical, moving through a world that demanded their presence in many places at once. Unlike peasant women, whose journeys might be to wells, markets, or mills, noblewomen often traveled for reasons of power and status. Their movements linked castles, manors, and courts together. When a lady of rank left her estate to visit another, it was rarely a simple visit. It was a sign of diplomacy, loyalty, or kinship. Her presence mattered. A noblewoman could represent her family, her husband, or even her sovereign. Imagine a procession leaving a stone castle in the rolling countryside. Horses stamp in the courtyard. Carts creak under the weight of trunks filled with gowns, linens, and gifts. Servants bustle, preparing food for the journey. At the center of it all, a noblewoman mounts a palfrey, a smooth-gaited horse suited to riding long distances. She wears a cloak of wool lined with fur, a hood drawn against the wind. Around her ride attendants, ladies-in-waiting, guards, perhaps even musicians. The group moves forward, banners fluttering, toward another lord's hall many miles away. Such journeys could last days, even weeks. Roads were slow, and hospitality along the way had to be carefully arranged. Noblewomen and their entourages stayed in monasteries, manor houses, or inns, where they were received with courtesy. Every stop became an occasion for ceremony, a shared meal, an exchange of gifts, a reaffirmation of ties between families. In this way, travel was not only movement, but also performance. Marriage once again played its role. Noble daughters were often married into distant families for alliances, and their journeys were grander and more public than those of village brides. A countess might cross entire regions to join her husband. A princess might sail across seas to meet a foreign king. These bridal journeys were carefully staged, with processions, banquets, and ceremonies marking every stage. The bride's movement symbolized not only personal change, but the weaving of political bonds across borders. Noblewomen also traveled to court. Royal courts were centers of culture, politics, and festivity, and noblewomen were expected to attend.
A summons from the king or queen could mean weeks of preparation, followed by long journeys through the countryside. At court, noblewomen displayed wealth through dress and manners, reinforced their family status, and sometimes influenced decisions. Their presence was not optional. To travel was to maintain rank. But beyond the ceremonies, noblewomen also traveled for practical governance. When lords were away at war or on campaign, their wives often managed estates. This required visits to villages, abbeys, and other holdings. A noblewoman might ride to inspect harvests, to negotiate with tenants, or to oversee building projects. In such moments, her travel was not glamorous, but essential. She kept the estates functioning. Her mobility ensured stability. There were also journeys of faith. Just like women of humbler birth, noblewomen went on pilgrimages. Some traveled to Canterbury, Compostela, or Rome. Others visited local shrines, bringing offerings and prayers. These journeys, while deeply personal, also held public meaning, for they showed devotion and piety expected of those in high rank. Imagine, if you will, a noblewoman's carriage moving slowly along a rutted road. The wheels creak, the horses strain, and yet the carriage carries her steadily onward. Inside, she leans against cushions, perhaps reading a pollster or speaking softly with a companion. Outside, the world passes. Villages, fields, forests, and rivers. For her, this is not idle motion. Every mile is tied to duty, to family, to reputation. Her footsteps, or her horse's hoofbeats, become threads in the great tapestry of medieval society. Of course, noblewomen did not travel alone. Their entourages meant that their journeys were rarely solitary. Yet even within the company of attendants, there was a kind of stillness. The long hours on horseback, the nights in unfamiliar halls, the endless rhythm of the road, all of these gave noblewomen their own relationship with travel, distinct from the men who rode to war or trade. Their mobility reminds us that women of every rank were part of the moving world of the Middle Ages. From cottages to castles, from markets to manors, their steps and their rides carried them further than history often records. So, when we look again at the picture of noble women, we should see more than embroidery frames and candlelit halls. We should see horses on the road, processions winding through valleys, banners catching the wind, and a woman at the center, calm and steady, moving because her world required it. Among the many paths taken by medieval women, one of the most striking was the path of faith. While noblewomen rode in processions and peasant women walked to markets, there were others who chose the road for reasons more spiritual than social. These were the women whose devotion to God or whose calling to service led them far from the familiar walls of home. Their journeys remind us that faith was never still in the Middle Ages. It moved with footsteps, it echoed along roads, and it rested in the hearts of women who carried it wherever they traveled.
Some women entered convents, where life was ordered by bells and prayers, but not all religious women remained enclosed. Many nuns and abbesses were required to travel. They moved between convents to teach, to guide, or to settle disputes. Some abbesses, who held lands as lords did, rode from estate to estate, managing the resources that supported their communities. Their movements were steady and purposeful, linking spiritual life to the practical rhythms of the land. There were also the great pilgrimages. To journey to holy places was seen as both an act of devotion and a way to seek healing, forgiveness, or blessing. Women of every class, including religious women, joined these pilgrim roads. They walked to Canterbury in England, to Compostela in Spain, and to shrines scattered across Europe. Along the way, they shared bread with strangers, sang hymns in chapels, and slept beneath the same stars as merchants and peasants. Their steps were prayers in motion. Imagine a group of women, their cloaks pulled tight against the evening wind, approaching a shrine set high on a hill. They carry candles, their light flickering against the stone walls. One woman leans on a staff, another carries a small satchel of bread, while a third clutches a rosary. They climb steadily, not with haste, but with purpose. For them, this journey is more than distance. It is devotion expressed in movement. Some women, however, wandered further still. They were not bound by convent walls or estates, but became holy women known for their travels. These wanderers might live for a time in one town, then move to another, offering prayers, guidance, or simple acts of kindness. They were often welcomed for their piety, though at times they puzzled or unsettled local communities. To see a woman choosing the road over stability was unusual, yet it carried with it a sense of sacred calling. Abbesses of renown sometimes undertook long journeys to meet kings or bishops. These meetings were not small matters. They influenced the direction of monasteries and the lives of hundreds of nuns. Picture an abbess, wrapped in a dark cloak, riding beside trusted companions through quiet woodlands. Her destination is a cathedral city, where she will meet a bishop to settle a dispute about land. Her journey is at once spiritual and practical, an echo of how faith and governance intertwined. The roads of Europe carried countless such footsteps. Some women traveled to Rome, where the relics of saints and the presence of the Pope drew pilgrims from every land. Others crossed the seas to Jerusalem, a journey of immense difficulty and danger. Yet records show that women did make these voyages. They walked the streets of the holy city, touched the stones of sacred places, and returned with stories that spread across their homelands. Religious women also traveled for charity. Some journeyed to care for the sick in leper houses or hospitals, moving where they were needed most. Their steps carried healing, comfort, and compassion. In this way, their mobility became a form of service, as vital as prayer. Even within their own regions, religious women were often seen on the move. A nun might walk to a nearby village to teach children. An anchoress, though enclosed for much of her life, might first travel from her family home to the church where she would be enclosed. Every stage of religious life involved movement, whether to enter, to serve, or to seek. When we think of the medieval wanderer, it is easy to picture a solitary monk, staff in hand, striding along dusty roads. But alongside him, sometimes less noticed, walked women. Their journeys were quieter, less often recorded in chronicles, but no less real. Their feet wore paths into the earth. Their songs, whispered or sung, floated through chapels and fields. In the hush of evening, as the stars rose over the medieval countryside, one might see a group of women resting by a roadside cross. Their cloaks gathered about them, their faces lit faintly by the glow of a lantern. They murmur prayers before sleep. Tomorrow, they will arise and walk again, their journey continuing toward a shrine, a convent, or perhaps an unknown place that faith will reveal to them. These religious women remind us that not all travel was driven by trade, war, or family ties. Much of it was guided by inner devotion. They were wanderers of the spirit as much as of the body, their journeys shaping both their own lives and the landscapes of belief. Not all travelers of the medieval world wore cloaks lined with fur or carried staffs of pilgrimage. Many wore aprons, simple wool dresses, and carried baskets. Their journeys were not to distant kingdoms or sacred shrines, but to markets, fairs, and crossroads. Yet these small steps were no less important, for it was through the steady travel of traders' wives and market women that food, goods, and daily life flowed across medieval towns and villages. The market was the heart of every community. Once or twice a week, bells would ring or horns would sound to signal its opening. Stalls were set up, tables laid out, and goods displayed. Women came from villages, hamlets, and farmsteads, their feet pressing familiar paths across the countryside. A woman might walk several miles at dawn, a basket balanced on her hip, filled with eggs, cheese, or herbs. By mid-morning, she would join a bustling square, alive with color, noise, and trade. Picture such a square. The air is filled with the calls of vendors, the bleating of sheep, the scent of baked bread. At one stall, a woman sells fresh butter wrapped in leaves. At another, a trader's wife displays bolts of cloth her husband has brought from afar. Children weave between the crowds, tugging at sleeves. Behind it all, the church tower rises, its bells reminding the market-goers of the rhythm of the day. For women, the market was not only a place of exchange, but also of travel. To reach it, they often crossed fields, rivers, or forests. A group of women might set out together, baskets swinging, sharing stories as they walked. Others might guide donkeys loaded with grain or poultry. These were not great distances compared to the pilgrim roads, but the regularity of the journeys meant that women were constantly in motion, stitching villages together through their steps. Traders' wives played a special role in this world. Merchants who journeyed to distant towns often relied on their wives to manage local stalls or shops. A wife might travel to fairs to sell spices, fabrics, or pottery. She might negotiate with buyers, tally accounts, or arrange new deliveries. Her mobility was part of the family's livelihood, ensuring that goods moved smoothly between producer and consumer.
Imagine a woman from a small farming hamlet arriving at a great fair for the first time. She has walked for hours, her basket heavy with honey. As she enters the square, she sees stalls of silks, spices, and jewels she has never known. She trades her honey for a length of cloth to make her daughter's dress, and perhaps for a small packet of salt. Her return journey, though weary, is marked by excitement. She carries more than goods. She carries stories of a wider world. Travel for market women was not always simple. Roads could be muddy, rivers might swell, and storms could make journeys long and difficult. Yet, these women persisted, for their families depended on their efforts. Their feet were as steady as those of pilgrims, though their prayers were often for good harvests, fair prices, and safe returns. In towns, shopkeepers' wives also moved regularly through city streets. They carried goods from workshops to stalls, delivered items to customers, and negotiated with suppliers. A weaver's wife might carry bundles of wool to be dyed. A baker's wife might deliver loaves to inns or monasteries. These daily errands, though short, made women constant travelers within the fabric of medieval towns. The rhythm of travel shaped their lives. At dawn, women set out along well-worn paths. By midday, they bargained and sold. By evening, they began the walk home, goods exchanged for coins or supplies. The path became familiar, yet always alive with change. New faces, shifting prices, rumors of distant lands. Their journeys also created bonds between women. Walking together, they shared news, sang songs, or discussed the challenges of the season. In this way, the road itself became a place of companionship and community. Each journey tied them not only to markets, but also to one another. Market women and traders' wives remind us that travel was not only for nobles, pilgrims, or knights. It was woven into everyday life. Their steps kept villages supplied, households fed, and towns alive with trade. Without their movement, the medieval world would have been poorer, quieter, less connected. So when we think of the Middle Ages, we must remember these women with baskets, satchels, and goods in hand. Their travels may have been humble, but they were constant, steady, and vital. Each journey, whether to a nearby stall or a distant fair, was part of the living heartbeat of medieval society.
Among the many reasons women traveled in the Middle Ages, one of the most important was care. Where there was illness, birth, or need, women often walked or rode from home to home, carrying with them knowledge, herbs, and comfort. They were healers, midwives, and caretakers. Their journeys were not grand like those of nobles or distant like those of pilgrims, but they were deeply essential. In their footsteps, life itself was sustained. Imagine a quiet village at dusk. Smoke rises from chimneys, children call in the fields, and a small path winds between cottages. Along that path walks a woman with a bundle under her arm. Inside are herbs wrapped in cloth, small jars of ointment, and perhaps a book of remedies. She is known in the community as a healer. Tonight, she is visiting a neighbor who suffers from fever. Tomorrow, she may be called to another village to help a child with an injured hand. Her travels never truly end, for need is always present. Midwives were especially mobile. Few roles drew women into the lives of others so often. When labor began, a messenger would be sent, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes across fields or through forests. The midwife would hurry, lantern in hand, carrying with her the knowledge of generations. She might travel many miles in a single week, moving from cottage to cottage, from manor to manor. Birth did not wait for daylight or for convenience. It called, and women answered. Their work required them to know the roads, the houses, and the people of wide regions. A midwife might be welcomed into the home of a farmer one day and the hall of a noble the next. She crossed boundaries of class in ways few others did. Travel was not only a part of her role, it was the thread that connected her to every corner of her community. Healers also carried remedies gathered from fields, woods, and gardens. They knew where certain plants grew and when they should be harvested. Their journeys sometimes took them far beyond their villages. To gather the right herbs, a woman might climb hillsides for thyme, walk riverbanks for willow bark, or enter shaded groves for nettles. Her movements were not only to treat the sick, but also to prepare for the needs yet to come. Picture such a healer standing in a meadow in early summer. She bends to gather chamomile, tying small bundles that will later be dried and kept. Birds sing in the hedgerows, and the wind stirs the grass. She carries her harvest in a basket, her steps leading her homeward. Yet before the week is out, she may walk again, delivering those herbs to a family in need. Her life is a cycle of gathering, walking, and giving. Some women also learned medical skills within convents. Nuns cared for the sick in hospitals attached to monasteries. Their duties sometimes led them to travel between houses, to learn new techniques, or to carry medicines where they were most required. In this way, their faith and their footsteps were combined in service. Travel was not always easy for these women. Roads could be long, weather harsh, and time uncertain. Yet urgency often outweighed hardship. A mother in labor, a child with a fever, or a man injured in the fields all called for immediate help. And so women walked, often without thought of delay. Their journeys marked not by distance, but by necessity. Their mobility also made them bearers of stories and knowledge. Moving between households, healers and midwives carried news. They learned what worked in one place and shared it in another. A remedy tried in one village might become common in several. Their footsteps spread both comfort and wisdom, weaving communities together. In the hush of a night, when the stars shine over sleeping cottages, one might see a lantern bobbing along a path. It belongs to a woman on her way to a birth. She walks steadily, her cloak pulled close, the sound of her steps softened by the earth. She knows that within a small house ahead, a new life is waiting to arrive. Her journey, though simple, carries more weight than any procession, for in her hands rests the hope of tomorrow. Healers, midwives, and women of medicine remind us that travel was not always about distance or grandeur. Sometimes it was about immediacy, about answering the call of human need. Their journeys were humble, but they were also heroic in their quiet way. Without their movement, countless lives would not have begun or might not have continued. So when we think of medieval travel, we must remember these women as well, with baskets of herbs, with lanterns in the dark, with knowledge carried not in books, but in memory. Their steps were guided by care, their roads lined with service, and their destinations marked by compassion. Not every journey of a medieval woman was for duty or for devotion or for trade. Some traveled with songs in their voices, stories in their memory, and instruments in their hands. They were the performers, the storytellers, and the entertainers of the Middle Ages. Their steps carried laughter, music, and tales across towns and villages, and their movements helped weave a culture that belonged not only to nobles, but to all who listened.
In village squares, at market fairs, or within the great halls of castles, these women were welcomed for the joy they brought. They were singers, dancers, minstrels, and tellers of tales. Some traveled alone, others as part of troops. Wherever they went, they carried the rhythms of life, the songs of the fields, the stories of distant lands, the laughter of shared amusement. Imagine a summer fair, the air warm with the scent of roasting meat, the chatter of buyers and sellers filling the air. Suddenly, a small space clears in the square. A woman begins to play a stringed instrument, her voice rising in song. Children gather first, then adults, drawn to the melody. Coins are tossed into a small basket, but more than payment, it is attention she receives. Her performance turns a busy market into a shared moment of delight. By evening, she will walk the road again, carrying her voice to the next town. Travel was essential for entertainers. Their livelihood depended on new audiences. A story heard once lost its novelty if repeated in the same place too often. A song that moved one village might already be known in the next. And so they walked, from fair to fair, from festival to festival, from hall to hall. Their journeys followed the rhythm of the calendar, tied to seasons of celebration, harvest, and holy days. In noble courts, entertainers were sometimes part of traveling households. A lady of the court might bring with her female musicians or dancers when she moved between castles. Their performances softened long evenings and marked festive occasions. Yet even these women were travelers, shifting with the fortunes of their patrons, their art always in motion. Some women carried stories rather than songs. Storytellers, skilled in memory, repeated tales of heroes, saints, and adventurers. These stories crossed regions, shaped by each teller's voice. A traveling storyteller might spend a night in a village inn, sharing her tale by the fire in exchange for food and lodging. Her words, like her footsteps, stitched together the imagination of the medieval world. There were also dancers and acrobats, women whose art required not voice, but movement. They performed in town squares, balancing on ropes or moving gracefully to music. Their travels often took them to larger gatherings, the great fairs, the feast days, the celebrations of nobles. Each performance was fleeting, lasting only a moment, but the memory lingered in the minds of those who watched. Picture such a performer in the courtyard of a castle. Torches flicker in the evening air as nobles gather after a feast. A woman spins with colored ribbons, her steps quick and light, her laughter carrying through the night. For her, this journey is both art and survival. When the performance ends, she will pack her ribbons, mount a horse, or walk the road, and continue to the next hall, where her skills will again bring wonder. Travel for entertainers was not without challenge. Roads were long, weather uncertain, and welcome never guaranteed. Some villages greeted them warmly, eager for distraction from daily labor. Others were cautious, uncertain of strangers who carried unfamiliar songs or movements. Yet still they traveled, for their art could not exist without motion. For women in this life, travel shaped identity. Each new place added to their repertoire, whether a melody picked up from another singer, a story heard in a market, or a dance step observed at a fair. Their journeys were not only outward, but inward, building their craft as they moved. In the hush of night, imagine a small troop resting by a roadside fire. A woman tunes her instrument softly, another hums a half-forgotten melody, while a third tells a story to pass the time. Tomorrow, they will reach a new village, and their art will once again transform a space into something magical. Their footsteps are not only movement across the land, but across hearts and imaginations. These performers, storytellers, and entertainers remind us that medieval travel was not only about need, but also about joy. Women carried with them laughter, music, and tales that lightened burdens and made gatherings brighter. Their journeys, though often unrecorded in chronicles, left echoes in song, memory, and story. So, when we think of medieval women on the move, let us also hear the strains of music, the rise and fall of voices, and the soft tread of dancers' feet. Their roads were the roads of art, and their travels gave shape to the culture of their age. In the bustling and often uncertain world of the Middle Ages, not every woman traveled as part of a family, a religious group, or a troupe. Some walked their paths alone. Among these were widows, women whose husbands had passed away, and others who, for one reason or another, journeyed without close companions. Their travels reveal another dimension of mobility in the medieval world, journeys shaped not by choice alone, but often by circumstance. Widowhood changed the course of a woman's life. With her husband gone, she might inherit responsibilities, property to manage, disputes to settle, or children to support. These duties often required movement. A widow might need to visit tenants, attend markets, or appear in town courts. Her travels, though practical, marked her as a figure of resilience, a woman stepping forward where once her husband would have stood. Imagine a widow rising early, her black cloak pulled around her against the morning chill. She walks a dirt road toward the village market, leading a small cart with produce from her fields. Her steps are steady, her gaze calm. Though she walks alone, her presence speaks of determination. She travels not for adventure, but for survival and responsibility. Some widows undertook even greater journeys. Those with means sometimes traveled to claim inheritances, moving between towns or estates. Others sought refuge in convents, their journeys carrying them to quiet cloisters where prayer replaced household labor. Still others traveled to live with distant kin, their journeys stretching far as they wove new lives. Women who never married, or who found themselves alone for other reasons, also became travelers. A single woman might move from town to town, seeking work as a servant, a spinner, or a nurse. Each position carried her to a new household, a new community. Her mobility reflected the need for survival, but also the adaptability that marked many women's lives. For some, aloneness offered a certain freedom. Without a husband's oversight, widows sometimes managed their own affairs with surprising independence. This independence could take them far afield. A woman with her own small means might choose to travel as a pilgrim, her journey an expression of both devotion and self-determination. In chronicles and records, we find traces of such women, unnamed travelers, known only by their offerings left at shrines or their presence in the rolls of inns. But traveling alone was not without challenges. Roads were unpredictable, and companionship often offered both safety and support. Widows and women alone sometimes joined groups of merchants, pilgrims, or other travelers for protection. Yet, even within such groups, their solitude was marked.
They were the ones who carried their own burdens, made their own decisions, and followed their own paths.
Picture a roadside inn at twilight. A group of pilgrims gather around the hearth, sharing bread and stories. Among them sits a woman, perhaps in her 50s, her hands folded in her lap. She speaks little, listening more than she tells. Tomorrow, she will continue on her way, not with family beside her, but with strangers who share the road. Her solitude is quiet, but it is also steady. In towns, widows were sometimes seen walking to courts or markets, their veils marking their status. Their journeys within the city might be short but frequent, part of their constant negotiation with a life reshaped by loss. In rural areas, a widow's road might stretch between hamlets and churches, her presence familiar to all who lived nearby. There were also women who became wanderers by choice, not bound to a particular home. Some lived by offering small services, spinning wool, brewing ale, or helping with harvests, moving from place to place as need arose. These women existed on the margins, their steps less recorded, but their travel no less real. The lives of widows and solitary women remind us that medieval travel was not always joyful or ceremonial. Often it was born of necessity, of resilience, of the quiet strength required to face a shifting world. Their movements were less likely to be celebrated in song or story, but they were every bit as significant in the lived reality of the Middle Ages. In the stillness of the countryside, imagine a lone figure walking along a hedge-lined path. The sun dips low, painting the sky in shades of gold. She walks steadily, a small bundle over her shoulder. Ahead lies a village where she will spend the night, perhaps taking shelter with kin, perhaps relying on the kindness of strangers. Her journey is neither grand nor famous, but it is hers, a testament to the countless women who traveled alone through the medieval world. Widows and solitary women carried with them both the burdens and the freedoms of their condition. In their steps, we see resilience, adaptability, and a quiet courage. They remind us that travel in the Middle Ages was not only for the privileged, but also for those who simply moved because life required them to keep going. When we think of medieval guilds, the associations of craftsmen who shaped the life of towns and cities, we often picture men at work, smiths at their forges, masons at their stones, weavers at their looms. Yet women too were part of this world. They wove, brewed, spun, stitched, and sold. Their skills contributed to households and communities, and their place in guild life often required movement. Women in crafts were not always bound to one workshop or one street. Their lives, tied to training, trade, and family partnerships, carried them along paths of quiet travel. Many crafts were learned within households. A wife often worked alongside her husband in the family trade, whether brewing ale, weaving cloth, or tanning leather. But learning did not stop at the threshold of a single home. Women sometimes traveled to other workshops for training, especially if their families wanted them to inherit useful skills. A young woman might be apprenticed to a seamstress in another town, her journey marking the start of her craft life. Picture such a journey. A girl of 16, carrying a small bundle of clothes, walking beside her father through the narrow streets of a town. They stop at the door of a skilled embroiderer. Here she will live and work for several years. Her steps no longer her family's, but her master's. The road that brought her here may be short, but it carries her into a new world of learning, labor, and independence. Guild regulations also created travel. Some guilds allowed women to sell goods in markets beyond their town. A brewer's wife might cart her ale to a neighboring village fair. A seamstress might bring finished garments to a town square several miles away. The rhythm of fairs and markets kept women on the move, ensuring that their crafts reached new customers. Great fairs,
such as those in Flanders or Champagne, attracted artisans from across regions. Women were part of these bustling scenes, selling textiles, lace, or embroidered works. Their journeys to such fairs were often long, following roads filled with merchants, pilgrims, and entertainers. For them, travel was not an interruption of daily life, but an extension of it, another way to sustain both household and craft. Widows, once again, played a distinctive role. A widow of a guildsman often inherited his workshop or right to trade. To keep the business alive, she might travel to collect supplies, to negotiate with guild officials, or to hire apprentices. Some widows became known as respected figures in their trades, their footsteps leading them across towns as they continued the work their husbands left behind. Imagine a widow brewer steering a small cart filled with casks of ale. The road is uneven, but she moves steadily, her apprentice walking beside her. She is known in nearby villages for the quality of her drink, and so she travels weekly to deliver barrels to inns and markets. Her presence is not unusual, for women were deeply involved in brewing, but her independence marks her as a figure of quiet strength. Women in textiles also traveled frequently. Spinners carried wool to fullers or dyers, walking through town streets or across countryside paths. Weavers' wives might deliver cloth to merchants or fairs. Embroiderers often worked on commissions that required them to visit noble households, carrying their frames and needles wherever they were needed. Each craft created its own patterns of movement, weaving women into the fabric of urban and rural life. Guild gatherings themselves required travel. Meetings, feasts, or festivals brought members together. Women who held roles, whether formally recognized or informally as wives and partners, often attended these events. Such journeys might be short, but they were part of the rhythm of community life, linking households together. Travel for craftswomen was often practical, but it was also cultural. As women moved between towns and fairs, they encountered new styles, patterns, and techniques. A lace maker from one region might learn a new stitch from another. A weaver's wife might see cloth dyed in a shade unknown in her town. These exchanges enriched their work, their journeys becoming pathways for creativity as well as trade. In the hush of a winter morning, imagine a group of women carrying baskets of thread and cloth through snowy streets toward a guild hall. Their footsteps crunch softly, their cloaks wrapped tightly. Inside the hall, warmth and fellowship await, but the journey itself, as small as it may seem, is part of the life of the craft. Women in guild and craft life remind us that mobility was not limited to nobles or pilgrims. It was woven into the lives of artisans, merchants, and apprentices. Their footsteps kept workshops alive, connected households to markets, and carried skills across regions. So, when we think of medieval travel, let us remember the women with spinning wheels, baskets of cloth, and casks of ale, women whose roads were the roads of craft, whose journeys shaped the work and culture of their towns. Not all medieval women traveled out of necessity, trade, or devotion. Some journeyed because power itself required them to. Among the most visible women of the Middle Ages were queens, regents, and noble rulers.
Their footsteps were followed by attendants, chronicled by scribes, and remembered in history. Unlike many who traveled quietly, their movements shaped politics, alliances, and the very map of kingdoms. For queens, travel was inseparable from their role. The queen consort often moved between castles and cities alongside her husband, supporting the king's court. She was present at coronations, festivals, and religious ceremonies, her journeys marking moments of royal display. These travels were not just symbolic. They were part of maintaining loyalty across the realm. When the queen appeared in a distant region, she embodied the connection between crown and people. Some queens traveled even farther,
Marriage alliances frequently carried them across borders, sometimes to lands utterly unfamiliar. A princess raised in one kingdom might find herself sailing across seas or riding for weeks to join the court of a foreign prince. These journeys were long, ceremonial, and filled with uncertainty. They were also essential to diplomacy, as the queen herself became the living link between two dynasties. Picture such a scene: a young noblewoman boarding a ship, the banners of her father's house fluttering in the wind. Behind her, she leaves the only home she has ever known. Ahead lies a distant shore, a new court, a new language, and a new role as queen. Her voyage is more than personal. It represents an alliance between kingdoms, sealed not with ink, but with her presence. Some women traveled not beside kings, but in their place. When a king was absent, at war, on crusade, or taken ill, his queen or mother might serve as regent. In these times, travel became a tool of governance. Regents visited towns to hear petitions, attended councils, and negotiated with nobles. Their journeys projected authority, reassuring subjects that the crown remained strong even in the king's absence. One might imagine a regent queen entering a great hall in a distant province. Her arrival is met with solemn ceremony. She speaks firmly to gathered nobles, her words carrying the authority of the crown. The journey that brought her here is political, but it is also deeply human. A woman stepping into the role of leadership, her presence guiding the realm through uncertain times. Noble women below the rank of queen also traveled widely. Duchesses, countesses, and ladies of estates moved between holdings to manage lands, attend courts, or secure marriages for their children. Their journeys could span hundreds of miles, crossing rivers, forests, and borders. They traveled with retinues, bringing not only family, but also scribes, servants, and guards. Wherever they went, their movements shaped the political fabric of the region. These political journeys were often highly visible. Towns decorated streets for royal entries. Bells rang from churches and guilds paraded to greet noble visitors. Queens and noblewomen, dressed in rich fabrics, became the center of pageantry. Yet behind the splendor lay practical governance, treaties to confirm, disputes to settle, loyalty to ensure. At times, queens also traveled for diplomacy beyond their own lands. Some acted as negotiators, carrying messages or leading discussions between rival rulers. Their words, spoken in council chambers or across banquet tables, could prevent wars or forge alliances. For these women, travel was not only ceremonial, but strategic, the road itself a stage for politics. Consider a quiet chamber in a distant castle where two courts meet. At the center sits a queen, her calm presence bridging cultures. The journey that brought her here was long, marked by rivers crossed and mountains passed. Now, with her words, she shapes peace. Her footsteps, the one seen by the common traveler, alter the course of kingdoms. Even in their most private travels, queens embody political meaning. A visit to a shrine might double as a statement of piety for the dynasty. A journey to a castle might signal royal attention to a troubled province. Their movement was never simply personal. It carried layers of significance. For the people who saw them pass, peasants on the roadside, merchants in towns, children gathered at city gates, the sight of a queen or regent traveling was memorable. The clatter of horses, the bright colors of banners, and the solemn pace of the procession turned the road into a stage. To witness such a passage was to glimpse the grandeur and weight of rule itself. And yet, behind the grandeur were individuals. Queens, like all women, experienced the fatigue of long journeys, the strangeness of new lands, and the challenge of responsibilities laid upon them. Though they moved in splendor, their travels carried both duty and burden. The journeys of queens and regents remind us that medieval women were not only travelers by circumstance, but also travelers by power. Their roads were lined with ceremony, yet they walked them with the same human resilience seen in pilgrims, artisans, and widows.
Each step connected households, kingdoms, and peoples, weaving women into the very fabric of medieval governance. Most of the women who traveled in the Middle Ages left no written record of their journeys. Their footsteps faded on dusty roads, their voices carried only in the moment, yet some traces remain. In chronicles written by monks, in letters exchanged between families, and in the quiet notes of officials. These records allow us to glimpse the paths women once walked, though often only in fragments, like pieces of a tapestry left unfinished. Chroniclers, men of learning who recorded the events of their age, sometimes mention women travelers. Their focus was often on queens or noblewomen, whose movements carried political weight. When a princess traveled to her marriage, a chronicle might note the route, the feasts, and the ceremonies that greeted her. Though brief, these descriptions preserved the sense of spectacle that accompanied such journeys. Picture a parchment filled with careful Latin script, a monk's quill scratching steadily across the page. He writes of a royal bride arriving in a city, describing the banners, the songs, the gifts exchanged. Beneath his words lies a reminder. Her journey was not simply personal, but part of the broader story of kingdoms. Through his record, her footsteps echo across centuries. Letters preserve a different kind of travel story. While chronicles emphasize ceremony, letters reveal the personal side. A woman writing to her family might describe the roads she had taken, the towns she had passed, or the welcome she received. These letters, carried by messengers across hills and rivers, linked distant places and kept relationships alive despite separation. Imagine a mother writing to her daughter who has traveled to another town as an apprentice. The mother asks if the journey was safe, if she has settled well, if the people treat her kindly. She tells of home, of neighbors and siblings, of the quiet rhythm of daily life. Though centuries have passed, these letters allow us to hear the voices of women across time, voices concerned with safety, belonging, and connection. Legal documents also recorded women's movements. When widows claimed property, their appearances in different towns were noted. When merchants' wives sold goods in markets, clerks sometimes recorded their names. Each entry, small and plain, is like a footprint left in ink.
These records were not meant to preserve travel stories, yet they do so nonetheless, giving us glimpses of women on the move. Some stories of travel took on a more legendary shape. Medieval storytellers embroidered real journeys with wonder, turning them into tales passed from hearth to hearth. A noblewoman's voyage might be retold with added drama, storms at sea, miraculous escapes, or divine protection along the way. Though embellished, such stories reveal the fascination medieval people felt for women who journeyed beyond their homes. In monasteries and convents, scribes sometimes preserved accounts of pilgrimages. These writings describe women visiting shrines, leaving offerings, and returning with tokens. A pilgrim's journey might be remembered in the margins of a prayer book or in the careful record of a donation given to a church. Though simple, such notes keep alive the presence of women among the countless travelers to holy places. Even art preserved travel. Illuminated manuscripts sometimes depicted queens or noblewomen riding in carriages, surrounded by attendants. These images, painted with bright colors and gold leaf, froze a single moment of movement. Though idealized, they remind us that women's travel was part of the visual imagination of the age. Yet for every recorded story, countless others remain silent. The washerwoman walking to the river, the spinner carrying wool to market, the widow traveling to a distant parish, their journeys rarely entered ink. They remain invisible except through hints and patterns. Still, even these silences speak. They remind us that travel was woven into ordinary life, whether or not it was written down. In the quiet of a medieval scriptorium, a monk might pause, his quill resting on the page. Outside, the sound of footsteps drifts in from the cloister, perhaps the steps of a nun walking to the chapel, or a visitor arriving from the road. He does not write of them, yet those steps are as real as the ones he records. And so it is with history. Much is remembered, much is forgotten, yet all was once lived. The stories preserved in chronicles and letters offer us a window, narrow yet precious. Through them we see queens riding in procession, widows making claims, daughters riding home. We glimpse the mixture of duty and hope that shaped their roads. These records, fragile and partial, still carry the echo of women's footsteps across the centuries. And in reading them today, we do not just recover facts. We reawaken the sense that medieval travel, for women as for men, was both ordinary and extraordinary, a part of daily life, yet also a thread that bound together families, communities, and kingdoms. As we reach the end of this exploration, it is worth pausing to reflect on what the journeys of medieval women truly mean for us today. Their footsteps, whether traced across villages or kingdoms, were more than simple acts of movement. They were expressions of duty, survival, devotion, and sometimes even quiet independence. Together, these journeys form a hidden history, one that lingers like echoes on old roads. Women's travel in the Middle Ages were shaped by many forces. Some walked for faith, their pilgrimages carrying them toward shrines and sacred places. Others journeyed for trade, carrying goods to markets or fairs. Still others journeyed because life demanded it, widows claiming rights, daughters sent for apprenticeships, wives supporting guilds and crafts. Noblewomen traveled in splendor, their movements shaping politics, while solitary women moved more quietly, their paths barely noted but no less real. In each case, travel wove women into the fabric of their world. Their steps connected households to towns, towns to markets, and kingdoms to kingdoms. The act of moving from one place to another created bonds, carried news, and spread ideas. Even the smallest journey, a walk to a neighboring village, a visit to a shrine, carried significance in a society where roads were rough and time was marked by distance. The legacy of these journeys is not only in the records that survive, but also in the patterns they reveal. Women were not fixed figures confined to hearth and home, as some simple images might suggest. They were active participants in movement, in exchange, and in cultural life. Their mobility reminds us that the medieval world was more dynamic and interconnected than it sometimes appears. Imagine for a moment all the paths walked by women across centuries, cobblestone streets in busy towns, forest tracks between villages, winding roads to monasteries, and dusty routes leading to faraway shrines. Each road carried countless untold stories. Some were joyous, others heavy with burden, but all were real. Together, they create a landscape of movement, a map not drawn on parchment, but traced by footsteps. This hidden story also shapes how we view history itself. Chronicles and letters preserved only fragments, often focusing on queens or noblewomen. But when we widen our view, we see that travel touched women of all ranks. The spinner and the seamstress, the pilgrim and the regent, the apprentice and the widow, each played a part. Their combined journeys give us a fuller picture of medieval life. And so, the legacy is twofold. On one hand, it is practical. Women's travel kept economies alive, linked families across distances, and supported faith and governance. On the other, it is symbolic. These journeys stand as reminders of resilience, adaptability, and quiet strength. Even when faced with constraints, women found ways to move, to connect, and to shape their worlds. Picture one final image, a medieval road stretching into the horizon, bordered by hedges and trees. Along it walk many figures, some riding carriages with banners flying, some carry baskets on their backs. Some walk alone, cloaked against the wind. Together, they move steadily, their footsteps mingling, their journeys overlapping. This is the true picture of travel in the Middle Ages.
a shared road filled with both grandeur and simplicity. When we listen to these echoes, we hear not just the past, but also something timeless. The desire to journey, to connect with others, to step beyond the familiar. These are not bound to any one era. Medieval women remind us that even in times of hardship or limitation, movement was possible, and with it came growth, change, and memory. As you settle into rest, let the thought linger that every road carries stories. The ones remembered in chronicles, the ones whispered in letters, and the countless ones left unrecorded all belong to the great tapestry of human experience. The legacy of medieval women's journeys is not only history, it is a quiet reminder that each step, however small, carries meaning across time.